Hello and welcome to FIFI's B-29 75th birthday celebration webinar. Her birthday is today, July 31st, 2020, and we are members of the Commemorative Air Force B-29, B-24 Squadron. My name is Al Benzing. I'm a B-29, B-24 pilot and instructor, and Conley is the education officer for the squadron, as well as the editor of the flyer, our newsletter, and he's a B-29 crew member as a scanner. As we begin this presentation, we'll let you know that we have had to cancel our Air Power History Tour this year because of the COVID-19. And so this webinar, as well as some fundraising campaigns, are our way to sustain these aircraft. We call it sustaining flight, and we've had a campaign ongoing for a month or so, and it involves, the initial one involves donating, and as a incentive, you can obtain some sneakers that have B-29 logos on them. Today we are rolling out a new incentive, and that is a set of books. We call it Books for Bombers. The Rain of Fire is a B-29 FIFI special edition, 75th birthday edition. And the Ted's Traveling Circus is a B-24 book on the 93rd Bomb Group. I'll have some additional information at the end of the webinar, but if you go to our website, CAF B-29 B-24.org, you'll have that available to look at the details. Thank you. Our agenda for this evening is to cover B-29 history and veteran stories, and then get into FIFI specific things. You know, her new mission of touring and giving ride flights since we have the new engines on in 2010. So various milestones that have come along in those last 10 years. And then how do we go about flying and operating this aircraft in the 21st century? It's no small matter to have a 75-year-old airplane. It has to be very well taken care of and flown. And then we'd like to invite you all to join our organization and become part of FIFI's future. We always keep in mind our veterans, the missions that they flew. We still, to this day, have veterans that come to see us, and we love having them, and it always reinforces in us the reason that we work hard at these tasks. So here we have a B-29 that has the left two engines inoperative. The props are feathered. So this crew is in trouble and may have a great deal of trouble getting all the way back home. They may indeed have to end up ditching in the Pacific. So we don't forget those dangers that those crews face in every mission.
All right, let's look at the history of this great aircraft. You got to keep in mind that there were heavy bombers in World War II, and in abundance. You had the British Lancaster, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, but the biggest of all was the B-29 Superfortress. In 1940, Boeing was awarded the contract to build this super bomber. The U.S. Army Air Corps wanted a plane that could take the fight to potential enemies in the Pacific, so they needed a plane with great range and capabilities. And 3 weeks into the contract, the model of this plane 341 was designed. 6 desirables for this aircraft. A pressurized aircraft where the crew could fly in comfort at high altitude, tricycle landing gear, greater speed, greater range, a bomb capacity, large bomb capacity, and a bomb payload interchangeability. But the Boeing folks made it even more desirable by adding electronically controlled remote guns, which were very unique to this aircraft, increased armor, a Norden bomb sight, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Interesting fact, the design, development, and manufacturing of the B-29 cost $1 billion more than the Manhattan Project. Here's some specs on the B-29. You can see the max speed, cruising speed, service ceiling, the incredible wingspan at 141 feet, and fuselage length of 99 feet, 12 50 caliber machine guns throughout the aircraft, remote controlled. You can see the fuel capacity and the engines, the Wright Cyclone R3350 engines, which did cause trouble, and we're going to talk about those later. Big aircraft, and just for comparison's sakes, here's a B-29, roughly the same size as a modern day 737. Where were these B-29 Superfortresses built? Well, by Boeing at their plants in Wichita, Kansas, and up where they're headquartered in the Seattle area. And who built them in these plants? Well, quite a few people, and quite a few were women. They were the famous Rosie the Riveter assembled these aircraft, and you can see just incredible shots here of assembly lines filled with B-29s under construction. Here's some more shots like that. Incredible to see so many in one place under construction. And if you think about the plane too, a lot of other companies contributed to the construction of this plane, making all kinds of parts. You can see a list here all over the United States, and a patriotic ad by one of those companies supporting their efforts with the B-29.
I could just add that there were two other plants that also built them in Omaha. It's where the atomic aircraft were built, and you also had a plant out in Atlanta. That didn't have near the numbers that the Boeing plants did, but they were spread among 4 plants.
Mentioned the troublesome engines. Here's some unfortunate shot of one B-29 that's gone down, most likely due to engine failure. And this was an ongoing issue that these aircraft had, and the crews had to wrestle with on many missions over great distances of ocean. When the plane was being tested, some of this came to light. You had Eddie Allen, a very famous test pilot at the time, who was tragically killed on a B-29. And later he was replaced by another gentleman here pictured named Bob Robbins. The Battle of Kansas is an important note in the B-29 history. These planes were heavily modified after construction, and this location in Kansas, quite a few of these planes could not be stored in the hangar for these modifications. So during wintertime, very rough weather conditions, you had crews working out on the ramp on these planes. And our squadron commander for many years, Niels Agather's father, Vic Agather, a very important figure we'll talk about, was in charge of a lot of this work going on at the famous Battle of Kansas. Al?
We were talking a little bit about B-29 crew. You can see the men lined up for inspection, and the normal crew were 10, and it was 11 if they had a radar operator, which quite a few did. So you have an aircraft commander and a co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, central fire control officer, and a left and right gunner in the rear, as well as a tail gunner. This is kind of what the layout was. And so we have on the left here, aircraft commander, on the right, the co-pilot, in the nose, the bombardier. Flight engineer sat backwards behind the co-pilot. On the left side at the table was the navigator, and on the right side is the radio operator. So this entire cockpit, which looks fairly large here, was pressurized. The area behind it was not, because this goes over the 2 bomb bays. Then you had a gunner's compartment, which is also fairly large, about the same size as that cockpit. And you have central fire control sitting up on a pedestal chair or barber chair, and he's looking through a bubble at the top. The left and right gunners are looking through bubbles on the side through an aiming device. And they did have some bunks and other things in the back at times. It depended on the configuration. And if there was a radar operator, he would be right here behind this small bulkhead. Then we had an area here that had the auxiliary power unit that was not pressurized. And then in the far tail is the lonely tail gunner in his own pressurized area. So let's take a look at World War II era crew stations. So you have the pilot, co-pilot, and bombardier sitting up here, and you can get a little bit of look at the instrumentation that they had. From the bombardier standpoint, he had a flat window that he would look out with his Norden bomb sight, which of course was top secret during that time. I'll also mention, it's not in view here, but he was also the forward gunner. He had a gun sight which looks a lot like the Norden bomb sight, and he could fire the top and bottom turrets from his position. The navigator, busy man, of course, he's going across 1,500 miles of ocean to find a small island. He's got a reasonable amount of equipment, including on aircraft with radar. He also had a repeater radar scope, which was very, very helpful in finding the coastline. So I think I'm getting it close, and bing, there's the coastline. That helps a great deal. But of course, it takes training to learn how to operate it. The flight engineer is the man that runs the B-29, then and now. He's operating the engines and the other systems. He has to be very skilled and is a very hard-working man. The radio operator, in this case, has a lot of equipment, and he's kind of stuffed in the corner behind the gun turrets. On a lot of missions, they were radio silent, but he might have a command radio set to talk to other aircraft, or there were missions where communication was essential. We talked about the central fire control. Here he is up there, you can see his pistol grips, and he can rotate 360 degrees around and either fire turrets himself, or he can indicate to the left or right gunner to take control. It's a very sophisticated and very good gun system. The tail gunner, he's relaxing there, but he would sit in this cubicle in the back, and the guns were remotely controlled from below him. In this one, we have a 20mm cannon as well as two 50 cals. The 50 cals were part of this gun sight system where it would be corrected for temperature, altitude, speed, and so forth to try to take out as much of the inherent errors as possible. But the cannon, I don't think, was tied into that system. It wasn't that successful, so they usually, or often they were removed from the aircraft. The radar operator, they had a couple of different versions of the radar. It was used for targeting as well as for navigation. It's awful hard to pick out little pieces on the ground, so the newer versions were somewhat better at that. Hap Arnold and Roosevelt, of course, wanted us to begin bombing Tokyo and other Japanese locations, and we did not have an airport from which to fly. So they made a big gamble in saying, well, why don't we go to India and then go over the Himalayan mountains to central China and fly out of there. The problem is that there was absolutely zero infrastructure there. And by that, I mean anything, no airports, no facilities whatsoever. So C-46s, C-47s, B-29s, converted B-24s into C-109 fuel haulers, all of that was used to carry equipment and fuel and munitions over the Himalayas up to central China, Chengdu area. My recollection is it says 460 aircraft lost. I think there were more than that. I remember 500 or so. So it was extremely expensive in lives lost. And it was still very difficult to have enough to fly the missions. There were no airports. The local population built the airports by hand, literally by banging rock against rock. They didn't even have tools like a hammer or sledgehammer. And a tremendous amount of labor expended on that. Early on, the first missions they tried to fly, or they flew, would be like over Burma and Indochina. They weren't quite as far, quite as dangerous as the big push to get to Japan, but they were in fact challenging. For one thing, the Japanese had control over a good deal of China and other areas they could harass with fighters. So you were never safe from fighter operations. Eventually, they gathered all their required supplies and said, let's run a mission to Japan. The southern island of Kyushu had a big ironworks at Yawata, which is right on the northern edge of Kyushu. And so they launched 68 aircraft. have a little story later about a friend of mine who was on that mission. They gave it a great effort, but it was pretty tough to put any bombs on target. And the assessment is that only one bomb actually struck the factory. So this is my neighbor, Bob Hilton. He flew early on these CBI missions and then later out of the Marianas. He was a photo specialist and he was on this first big raid. His aircraft was in a 4-ship. I think they were the tail end Charlie, and then the lead that had radar and communication had a technical problem. So they moved to the back of the formation and Bob's plane moved up front. I think they were the only other one that had radar. And that aircraft that was in the back did get hit. I don't remember now if it was shot down or just damaged, but that's the way war goes sometimes. So we are very happy to honor Bob at one of our events as we honor the veterans and their sacrifices. The Marianas campaign, it was a very big thing for the Navy, Marines, Army to take the Marianas Islands, which were primarily Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. It was a very tough slog. And by the time they did this in mid 1944, everybody was getting desperate to have the B-29s out of China and to fly them from somewhere where they could do some good. So the Seabees came onto the island and in very, very short order built a fantastic set of facilities, 4 runways at the North Field. I think there were 3 or 4 on the West Field. On Tinian, they built a runway on Saipan, on Guam. This is what Tinian looked like from the air. I've been over here, I've flown over this, and it's still an amazing sight. Here's North Field, I believe this is West Field down here. I think there were also some fighter strips on it. So once they finally had a location they could fly from, albeit at maximum range, they still had a lot of hardships and challenges. The weather was always a problem. If you're flying over Japan, you can't see your target. You know, it's hard to bomb it and hit anything. The jet stream was mostly a puzzle and it was extremely strong. So as far as just staying on course was a problem, dropping bombs through it was a problem, and bombing through the overcast was not very accurate. Now, what did that lead to? A whole lot of crews risking their lives to try to destroy a target that didn't get destroyed, and then you've got to go fly 400 airplanes out there again. So kind of talk about how they worked through that.
So obviously, the leadership was very frustrated. So Hap Arnold and General Haywood Hansel were orchestrating everything, but they brought in their ringer, I guess you'd call it, Curtis LeMay from the European Theater, and he took over.
And he had been in the CBI at that point.
And he'd been in the CBI for a short time before he was given this opportunity to change the bombing strategy completely and quite dramatically, because we were flying bombers meant to bomb from high altitude in relative safety, but we weren't getting our results. So LeMay's strategy was to take these bombers and fly them to targets at night from 10,000 feet roughly and firebomb cities. This worked, and this worked in a big way. Probably the time that the B-29 really became a full weapon of mass destruction. The first mission of its kind was called Operation Meeting House over Tokyo. 334 B-29s dropping incendiaries on targets below, and the Japanese structures were very condensed wooden bamboo structures. So it just lit up like crazy, and 100,000 people lost their lives, and the Japanese really had no way to extinguish the fires. 267,000 buildings destroyed in 25% of Tokyo, and that became the norm for B-29 missions. This is a very special veteran that we've become acquainted with in our squadron, Charles Chauncey. He flew the original night missions and flew 35 missions aboard his B-29 Going Jesse. And I remember talking to him. He was very proud that of all of his missions, they never had an abort, but they did have some very dangerous experiences. He said that the Low-level flying, when the fires were raging, would create thermal updrafts that could toss B-29s around and damage them. And then again, trying to get back, even if you had any damage or none at all, concerned about these troublesome engines. He said, you try to get any shut-eye, you had to keep one eye open because you were always listening for some type of irregular noise from the engines. So here's a map demonstrating both the distance the planes flew from the island bases in the Marianas up to locations around Japan, including at the very top, the Tokyo raid that was discussed, and several other raids. And the casualty figures are very high, but it was war, and this was an effective way, it turned out, to use the B-29 Superfortress. We had opponents up there. Al had mentioned fighters could scramble and attack us at all different places, including on these missions over the water to get to Japan. We had several different kind of fighters, and the Japanese had high performance fighters that they could launch to meet the B-29s and attack them and do damage to these planes. These pilots were fearless and they were defending their homeland. And then you had flak. The flak wasn't maybe as much of a problem early on in the campaign, but when they did start bombing the homeland and bombing at low altitude, if the searchlights zeroed in on a B-29, the flak could be very concentrated and deadly. And then, as I said, these pilots were fearless and they were also desperate in some ways. They couldn't sometimes get within range of these B-29s to shoot them down because of the sophisticated gun systems on the B-29. So many resorted to flying in and trying to ram these bombers to take them down. And when the bombers did go down, often over the long stretches of ocean, they would pray that when they brought their bombers down, that they were on a route that submarines were traveling to actually hopefully pick up down B-29 crews, or if they were in range of a search and rescue aircraft. But sadly, that wasn't often the case because the distance was so great. Here's a beautiful painting by Brian Bateman of some B-29 crew members that have escaped their bomber on the water. And then back at base, you had relatively primitive living conditions. They were on very hot tropical islands, often conceived not in full dress uniform, of course, because they were sweating bullets probably in that humid air and dealing with malaria and all kinds of the problems that come with living in a tropical environment. So it was very hard and not probably even comfortable to be in the B-29s when they were high altitude and in pressurized cabins. The ground crews worked quite hard to fill these bomb bays with massive loads of bombs and make sure all their planes were armed before missions. Here's some other shots of ground crews replacing engines on these massive aircraft, and here they are getting propellers ready to fly, making sure they're oiled and ready, and then filling up these planes with enough fuel to make the mission. The bomb loads for B-29s could vary by the size of the bomb, and that was one of the desirables. We had quite a few 500-pound bombs in there, and maybe not as many of the larger bombs. And then you can see the incendiary bombs that became prevalent in the late night bombing, low-level missions, and what they look like. And then nose art. The B-29 was a great canvas for whoever the artist might be in the squadron or unit as part of the crew. Our B-29 FIFI has the letters FIFI on the side, and they were painted by an original CAF crew member named Bill Godwin. But you had B-29s with all kinds of wonderful art that represented perhaps the personality of the crew, babes or girls that they remembered back home, or cartoon characters, just fantastic nose art. And the B-29 really was characterized when you were looking at the tail, you could see what bomb group they were in. And here's some examples of the very prevalent markings on the tail of B-29, and often the only color you would see on a B-29. Iwo Jima was a critical battle for B-29s. We took that island at great cost to the Marines, but we needed to take that island. For one thing, it was right on the path to Japan from the Marianas. So not only did the Japanese have fighters that could go up, rise up and meet the B-29s, but they also could warn the homeland that the B-29s were coming. And then once that island was taken, B-29s that were in jeopardy could use it as an emergency landing strip. And then once we took the island, we could put our own fighters there because they would be in range of Tokyo. These VLR Mustangs could make it. They could make it, though, with the assistance of the B-29s, which helped navigate them to Japan. And we have had an opportunity to meet one of these pilots, Captain Jerry Yellen, flew with the Bushmasters, and he flew 19 missions from Iwo Jima, and was very grateful for the assistance of the B-29s. Long missions, and he would be cramped in that B-29 when he'd get back.
B-51, yeah.
Oh, B-51, sorry, Al. But he flew the last mission of the war and survived and wrote 5 books about his experience. We found that toward the end of the war, there wasn't as much resistance in the air or perhaps from anti-aircraft. So maybe as an act of mercy, we dropped warning leaflets over cities that were to be bombed in the coming days. And I hope that we all probably would hope that that did attract the attention of some civilians who took safety. Of course, the most famous B-29 mission would be the Enola Gay dropping the bomb on August 6, 1945, and then Boxcar a few days later over Nagasaki. And we have Paul Tibbets coming up on some slides, and Al's going to talk.
So we'll talk a little bit about some veterans from World War II. Don Nass is a gentleman that came to our tour stop in Janesville last year, and one of our squadron mates took him up into the aft portion of the B-29, which we normally don't tour people back there. It's too hard to get in and out. But he wanted to see, where he used to sit up in that pedestal chair. So he was very appreciative of that. And then I did meet him briefly, and he had asked if we could fly over his house, which wasn't too far away, while we went transitioned up toward Oshkosh the following day or two. And I wasn't sure if that would work, but he said, yeah, we'll give it a shot. And so here's a picture of us flying right over Don Nass's house. And he was down in the yard with a flag, and he had friends and family there. And it was a great honor to be able to do that. Subsequently, Kurt Lewis and I have talked to him on the phone. We've sent him these photographs and so on. And in fact, earlier this month, I stopped by to visit with him. And he's a great resource as well. How did things go for central fire control, and how did the gunners work and all that? Very, very fascinating. So we're happy to honor him and others like him. His daughter here, he wrote to me about his daughter, who was a producer on a video called Bomber Boys. FIFI was part of this years ago. And I believe that she got a ride on this airplane. So it's another connection. This gentleman has been part of our squadron as well. Fisk Hanley is 100 years old. And we honored him on his 100th birthday last fall. And he was flying on the low-level mining missions on Shimonoseki Straits. Was shot down, barely got out of the aircraft. He was injured and burned, and then, of course, beaten by the farmers in the area. And so finally was rescued, so to speak, by the police. Ended up in prison, thrown on a train to Tokyo, to the Kempai Tai prison, which is notorious for its brutality and torture. And he suffered it every day. Until the end of the war. So it was a number of months that he had to put up with that. They called him an American war criminal rather than a POW because he was a B-29 crew. Just to give you an idea, here's the narrow straits. Shimonoseki is between the southern island of Kyushu and the main island of Honshu. And by mining that strait, it was very, very effective in shutting down Japanese shipping, as well as mining other harbors. By the way, Iwata is in this general area, in northern Kyushu. Kitakyushu is northern Kyushu. Another gentleman, I've gotten to know his family. I never met Charles Phillips. He's passed away, but I know his daughter and husband, who rode on our aircraft on a tour stop in Prescott. And they told me about a book that he had written. And when I read this book, I found it so compelling. There's so much information in it. He talks about the transition from the very early engines, which were terrible, to how they became how they were modified and became more and more reliable as time went on. And in fact, he flew 31 missions, combat missions, and 2 POW supply missions. Of his adventures and difficulties, on August 6th, which is the date that Hiroshima was bombed, he ended up ditching just a few miles short of Saipan, where he was based. And he learned some very important details about ditching from some other crews that had survived it. In fact, he didn't even get wet. The cockpit never dipped under, he never got wet. And a LMS, I think it was, picked them up, opened their clamshell doors, picked up their rafts, and so they were saved. After his POW missions, he actually flew a 23.5-hour mission from Iwo Jima, tried to go nonstop to Washington, D.C., but they didn't have any tailwind, so they only got as far as Spokane, Washington. And they were bringing with them reels of film of the first Americans that were landing in Japan after the armistice, or after the surrender. So very fascinating, and it's a fascinating book as well. And we'll see here that we now have a FIFI edition of that. The Korean War was sort of a different animal for the B-29. There's a saying about you always are fighting the last war, and that certainly was true here. The B-29s were sort of rushed out of their storage to, hey, let's go to Korea and bomb the targets there. But that was not an easy thing. Fortunately, they didn't have to go as far because they could be based in Okinawa, which isn't that far from the Korean Peninsula, although once you get further north, it is a bit of a trip. But some of the challenges were that now you're trying to do precision bombing on bridges, and precision bombing from altitude, we know, is very, very challenging. The biggest challenge was that the North Koreans were flying MiG-15s, and probably with Russian pilots a lot of times. And so there were a lot of B-29s that were shot up and shot down. So the role for the 29 changed. Then they became tankers for the fighters. Then they became transports or electronic surveillance aircraft because they were no longer viable as bombers. So the ones that survived the war, they were cut up for scrap for the most part. And there were a few that were used for target practice, which is what FIFI was destined to be. And here, one of them that went into the fact that ended up in the museum, a couple of the very famous ones, the Enola Gay and Boxcar and so forth, are in museums, but it took a lot of effort and a lot of years to get them properly represented. So this is the Enola Gay in the Smithsonian Annex at Dulles. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a beautifully restored aircraft. So we're going to talk about our girl FIFI. She has a very unique history of her own. We talked about her birthday being the 31st of July, 45. Well, that's just 2 weeks before the war ended. So she never went overseas as far as we know. And by October of that year, she was already being modified to be a TB-29 or a trainer. Don't know any details on that, but by the following spring, she was declared excess. And a year after that, year and a half after that, assigned as an administrative aircraft. Again, that's hard to know just what she was used for, but was still in the inventory. So things changed a number of times. Here in 1952, she was returned. She came out of maintenance and out of storage to be returned as a B-29A. And then a year later, year and a half later, I think here, she was once again modified to be a TB-29 trainer. So a few years pass, and then in October of 58, she is transferred to the U.S. Navy at China Lake at their Naval Weapons Center and going to be used as a target. Then the CAF did get involved, so there's a couple of dates here that relate to the CAF. And this painting here represents Lloyd's dream. Lloyd Nolan was the head of CAF at that time, and their mission really was to acquire and restore and fly one of every type of World War II aircraft. And in this painting, you can see B-29 is part of that, as is a B-24, like our Diamond Lil. So they had audacious dreams and they worked hard to attain them, which they did. Roger Baker, one of the original men that formed that organization, was flying over the China Lake area and saw the B-29s. There was a great deal of difficulty in determining who owned them and who would release them. Vic Agather, who had put so much work into these aircraft with the Battle of Kansas and thought he was pretty much done with B-29s, he did get very interested in having acquired one. So he used his connections. He knew a lot of people in Washington and elsewhere, and through his connections and dollars was able to obtain this aircraft for the CAF. And so it was finally released to the CAF by the Navy. So here we can see what it looks like in the desert. And here's a close-up of it. The airframe is intact, reasonably good shape. They looked at a dozen or so aircraft and thought, well, this will be the best one. But as with most of the aircraft, the instruments had been removed and repurposed. So all of those had to be acquired, installed, tested, and so on, along with hoses and other things that would have deteriorated in that 15-year period. But after 9 weeks of hard work, they were ready to fly. And Randy Sohn was the man to do it. They had no one who had flown the B-29 involved in this, but Randy had flown in the National Guard, Air National Guard, C-97s, and he was very experienced with aircraft. So he was chosen to be the most qualified of the unqualified, or something along those lines. Lefty Gardner and Roger Baker were also involved in that flight. This is a historic picture here in that there's Randy Sohn on the left some years later, and here's Niels Agather, the son of Vic Agather, and FIFI in the background. So we just love the picture. And Randy, of course, and his crew flew that aircraft nonstop from Central California all the way to South Texas, 6 hours and I think 38 minutes nonstop. So it's a lot of gas on that airplane and pretty audacious, but they did it. At that time, they only had permission to fly one flight, so that became an issue a little later. So out of almost 4,000 built, there was only the one flying. Now there's two, but FIFI's the one that's been flying since 1971. Victor Agather christened the aircraft FIFI. In other words, he was naming it for his wife. His nickname was FIFI, so it was a nice touch. And the CAF decided to recognize Vic's leadership to paint A for Agather on the tail of the aircraft, which we proudly display to this day, as well as the name FIFI. It took several years of maintenance to have this aircraft well restored. And when she did get out, I think it was 74 when she was first flying, very, very popular. So she draws a crowd, did then and does to this day. Here are just some of the milestones along the way. She's been in many different movies, including The Right Stuff. Here she is in Roswell. Here she's got the painting on from a movie, Fertile Myrtle, and as well as FIFI's painted over it afterwards. Mike Vance is a gentleman that's in the area here. He flew as a crew on a lot of these flights. And here's FIFI as the Enola Gay in that movie, and Randy Sohn flew it for this movie. It was a joy to talk to Randy over the years. He has such great stories. He's just passed away this past spring. Here's a picture, and this is really an iconic picture. This is just awesome. Here's Randy Sohn. They're obviously looking at something. He's looking at something, puzzling something. And over here is Paul Tibbets, General Paul Tibbets, who dropped the atomic bomb using the Enola Gay. Behind Tibbets is Vic Agatha. And this gentleman, who I wasn't familiar with, but Brad Pilgrim came to the rescue, and he told me that's Warren Earhart. So what a great picture. And here we show Paul, who had checked out in FIFI in '76. And at that time, he would come down there and fairly regularly fly the aircraft. I mean, that was fantastic. Mike Vance was telling me about that. He said, oh yeah, Paul come down there and he'd fly it all the time, shows and whatever. And then in later years, in 1998, he came back and he flew it a little bit. Over the years, the engine issues continue to rise up and cause us problems. There were still overheating issues and reliability issues. And eventually, even the engines that they had just had overhauled only lasted a few hours. And they finally said, we have to figure out a different way to do this. And they shut the airplane down for a number of years. Finally, in 2010, or just prior to 2010, Jim Kavanaugh from the Kavanaugh Museum pledged $1.2 million for the re-engine project. And that was the lifesaver. That was the game changer. And the new engines were still 3350s. Some will call it a hybrid engine. I'll just call it a more modern version that was modified to fit the B-29. And it was fantastic to be able to get her flying again. Just as a note that we have the engine cowlings painted with these names. We got Ingrid and Mitzi and Betty and Rita, and they stand for Ingrid Bergman, Mitzi Gaynor, Rita Hayworth, and Betty Grable. Somebody came up with Greta over here, Greta Garbo, but I'm not sure which engine we would put that on. Maybe it's the spare. Today, the CAF is a very large nonprofit organization, 10,000 plus members. Our headquarters had moved from Harlingen to Midland. It was in Midland for about 25 years. And a few years ago, moved to the Dallas area, Dallas Executive Airport, where our new facility is being built this summer. As we speak, they are putting up the buildings. So we have 70 squadrons in 25 different states, 173 vintage aircraft, bombers, fighters, some foreign aircraft, liaison, cargo and transport, trainers. And our goal is to have these flying. So if you're in a unit that has an aircraft assigned to you, you are expected to get this aircraft in condition and fly that aircraft. Very much a volunteer organization. There are very few paid personnel. They're only where it's absolutely necessary that we have them. So we're going to have Cotton talk for just a few minutes here.
Yeah. So our new mission, really beginning after the engine change, was to take this plane out to the public. And this has been delivered on by doing tour stops all over the country and ride flights. And so here you see the website for the squadron. And then down below, the Air Power History Tour website, which is how we branded our tour. And Audrey Hudson, our office administrator, who's your contact for all things related to the tour and manages things back to home base or while we're out on the road. This is what a ride flight would look like. Here you have the crew briefing some riders about to board the plane, and a great shot by Kevin Hong. And this is a very friendly bunch at our ride desk. This is where the riders will be greeted, and they will find out more about the specifics of what they're going to do and safety and so forth. Some of that's covered on the plane as well, but they'll get orientated and get their badge and get ready to go. This is our PX crew, Rocky and Alma. travel everywhere the plane goes, and they have a great trailer, but they just have a great heart, and they get out to all the events, and it creates kind of a home away from home for the crew. And their website is pictured here. All of us have their apparel and hats and other things, and they're very popular because people want to connect to the aircraft, and getting something from the PX is a great way to do that. Cockpit tours are an essential part of the tour, and often the ride flights will take place in the morning to accommodate cockpit tours late morning and through the afternoon. And there could be lines so long, and often people will use the immense shade from the wing to try to keep out of the sun when they're waiting to tour the plane. But where else on the planet can you get in through the bomb bay of a B-29 and go in the cockpit and have somebody up there to answer questions about the cockpit of a B-29 Superfortress? So very, very popular part of the tour. The educational banner that is on the aircraft when it's static is cool, because the information that we covered, a lot of it in the history, is on the banner with some great information, and the crews are kind of relieved of that duty because the public can read it right there. But the kind of coolest thing is Charles Chauncey and other veterans that have had an important mark on the B-29 history are featured in crew stories. So that's a great way to share that with the public. Our communication throughout the squadron and to the public is done through what we hope will be webinars now. Webinars are, this being our first one from the squadron. There have been a few about FIFI and Diamond Low, but we hope to see a lot more, and perhaps you can help with that down the road. We have a newsletter, which I manage right now. I try to get one out about every quarter. I'm working on the summer issue now. And I got to give kudos to Al Benzing and the leadership in the squadron that put together these magnificent handbooks and manuals for training purposes, and they're essential to the operation of the squadron. Once we get out on the road, we have Air Power History Tour posters that go out to kind of get the public excited about the event and let them know who's coming to the event. We attract a lot of airplanes that will come from a region we're in to the event, and we can offer ride flights there too. And then we have a PR campaign that goes with our PIO, who gets the information out to the media. And then, of course, our website. Back at home, we try to engage the squadron members that live in our area by having membership meetings. And at the membership meetings, we usually eat, and we get a chance to catch up with each other. But we'll try to get a keynote. We've had all kinds of interesting keynotes over the years in all different aspects of World War II. Often we even had an SR-71 pilot, not exactly World War II, speak at one of our events. But it's a great way to catch up and also get some information on a part of history. And here's just a shot of some of our meetings going on. We either have breakfast or lunch meetings typically. And probably one of the greatest things about our meetings is we do attract some local veterans, and you can see several in the corner here, including Fisk Hanley in the foreground. And milestones. Milestones over the last 10 years for FIFI have been many, and we just have a sample here. We mentioned Paul Tibbets II, the general that dropped the atomic bomb from, oops, sorry about that. Dropped the atomic bomb from the Enola Gay. Well, his grandson, Paul Tibbets IV, went into the Air Force and became a B-2 stealth bomber pilot. And you see him pictured with his grandfather in FIFI's cockpit. Well, several years later, in 2016, P4, as we call him, got a chance to fly FIFI, and that was a quite cool event. I happened to be there. Then we got a painting of the B-2 and honoring both the grandfather and the grandson with the Enola Gay in the background. Really beautiful painting. FIFI ventured to Canada in 2018, and Al was on that mission. You have anything to share about that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I do want to mention that Paul IV was also attained the rank of general and was in charge of the bombers, B-1s, B-2s, B-52s. I'm not sure where he's at now, but I thought that was a very interesting lineage, so very proud of him. Canada was quite a trip. It was 6 weeks worth. I did first 3 weeks, I think, along with a good number of crew members. And although it's just across the border and it's only a little different, it was surprising how different it could be operationally. They were very, very welcoming of us. They did everything they could to make our stay rewarding, and the people came out in droves to see the airplane. But things as simple as, well, where can we land and get avgas, which you don't even think about in the U.S. It got to be a big deal up there because they don't typically have avgas at the airports. It's more Jet A oriented. That and, FIFI needs a nice long runway, and they didn't always have that available where we would like. So anyway, but it was a great experience, and I'm glad that we had the opportunity to do it.
Thank you. We've had some really interesting pilots and crews join us on tour. Here you have Jeff Skiles, Sully's co-pilot from the Miracle on the Hudson. He flies with the crew and flies FIFI and gets a chance to interface with the public. So that's quite cool. FIFI flies with some amazing warbirds. As I said, they will join us out on tour. And here's some examples. You have the Camarillo wing of the CAF. They're real, authentic, flying zero. Of course, our B-24 Diamond Lil with FIFI in formation. And then you have a couple Mustangs in the bottom pictures. You have the Brat 3 flown by the Cavanaugh Flight Museum in Addison, Texas, and Gunfighter, a very popular P-51 that joins FIFI at many tour stops. So the CAF was in Midland, but in 2014, ultimately a decision was made to move the headquarters and form a national air base in Dallas. So here you have the mayor of Dallas announcing that before a crowd of dignitaries and CAF folks and veterans, and FIFI made a marvelous background for that. So FIFI loves the squadron, and the squadron loves her. This is a shot from a B-29 ground school that we had recently. And it's interesting to note, these are the ground school trainees that will be working on FIFI scanner positions, ride desk positions in support of the aircraft. This doesn't even include the large group of pilots and co-pilots and flight engineers that were also training that day. Debbie King's an interesting person to note from FIFI's history. She was an accomplished pilot, flew private jet aircraft, I believe, and joined the squadron. Her father was also in the squadron and flew FIFI, but she had a great milestone for herself and for FIFI when she became the third qualified woman to fly B-29, following in the footsteps of Dor Dodery and Dee Dee Mormon, who flew the B-29 and were trained to fly the B-29 under the command of Paul Tibbets, who wanted two women to fly this big, monstrous bomber. Theirs was called Lady Bird, out to air bases. And when they land, the men would come out to see the plane, saw these two women coming out, and I don't know, maybe it did make an impression on them that these women could fly this big, intimidating aircraft and might have helped with recruitment for pilots and so forth. Greatest mission for us is to meet the veterans. Here's some shots of veterans reminiscing, drawing a crowd, of course, they always do. And veterans will, if they can, get into the plane and fly. This gentleman here hadn't been in the bombardier seat in over 68 years, I think, and got a chance to fly on FIFI. So that's a treasure. We can see veterans and meet with their families. So FIFI in the next generation, very important that we carry on this mission and we educate, inspire, and honor these aircraft and bring the younger folks into the fold and tell these stories. And sometimes people might even paint a face at an air show like I did here. And at air shows, FIFI is well, we're biased, but the most popular attraction. She is the crown jewel of the air shows, and when she flies, every eye is on the sky. And this is a shot of her at Wings Over Dallas, where we're having air shows now that our headquarters is established here. And she also makes her way up to the biggest air show at Oshkosh, and you can see a massive crowd out there to see her. And when they have awards, she is an award winner typically. And then in 2015, she joined about 100 other warbirds to fly over the National Mall as part of the 70th anniversary of World War II. And Al will be talking about something coming up like that in just a moment. Our active military loves to come out and see the aircraft, and we can sometimes do special events like this re-enlistment. And then you have also Medal of Honor flights. And when you get a chance to fly veterans, such as this one, which is quite an honor for the crews and get her up in FIFI. And now Al is going to talk about touring and flying this plane.
All right, thank you, Ken. This particular aircraft, you know, we love flying her and operating her, but it takes a lot to accomplish that. Ground crew and flight crew. And part of that is because it's a very large aircraft, 141 feet wingspan, 99 feet long. The thing that gets our attention here is the prop clearance. The inboards are 14 inches from the ground. It looks less than that, trust me. But at least they are right up by the landing gear, so it's not as critical as the outboards, which although they're higher off the ground, they are also further out on the wing and just happen to be about where the taxiway lights are at many places. Northern airports will have tall taxiway lights as well. So we have to watch for that carefully. Here's what, just a little bit about what the cockpit area looks like. This is the business end in World War II, and it looks very busy, which indeed it is. It's crowded with all kinds of equipment. Here's what ours looks like, somewhat less busy, but we're standing in the back here, in this round area at the bottom and the roundish area at the top show where the internals of the gun turrets would have been. We have the external parts, so it looks like we have gun turrets, but we don't have the internals, so it's relatively spacious as compared to in the wartime. We move forward to the cockpit a bit, we see the entry door from the nose gear. This is where the crew comes in. And to the left of that is the navigator's table. We've had this signed by the navigator of the Enola Gay, Dutch Van Kirk, and very proud of that. He's flown on this aircraft. Here we can see the instrumentation that the navigator has. This is the aircraft commander's location, and notice that this instrument panel is just sitting out here in the middle of nothing. It's not by the windshield, and it's just odd at first when you sit there and go, wow, how do I get used to this? But you do acclimate to it. To the left side are the 4 throttles. On the right side where the co-pilot sits, he also has 4 throttles. They're a little bit hidden here, and the flight engineer has 4 throttles. So there's a protocol as to who uses that what and when. Here's the bombardier's seat. Jump here. There we go. Bombardier's location. He's got the Norden bomb sight, and just to the right of that, a bit out of sight, but this is a gun sight that he can move to the center, and then he will be responsible for the upper and lower gun turrets as they're coming into and leaving the bombing area. We have a new set of radios this year by mandate of the FAA right here, and during our tour stops, we put a little cover over that so they're not quite as evident. But we have the red handles here, which are our emergency brakes. We got feather buttons for the engines. Interestingly, the gear lever is just a little toggle switch with a guard on it. Our flap lever is just a toggle switch, and next to it is the emergency flap switch. So it's all electric airplanes, a little different than what you might expect. Here's the flight engineer's panel. He sits backwards behind the co-pilot, and he has all the instrumentation, switches, starters, generators, and so on. A very busy guy. He really has to know this airplane, and our engineers are really awesome. This is his lower panel where he has the throttles, the mixtures, and the prop switches, and many other controls. Just a view here, a general layout of the center section of the aircraft. You have a forward bomb bay. If you had 500 pounders, you could have 20 of them in here. You have an identical aft bomb bay behind the wing. And you have a tube that goes across the top. This is a great engineering idea. It allowed the crew to go from the front to the back in pressurized comfort, so to speak, even though the bomb bays below them were open, not open, but they were not pressurized, so they would be cold. Here's what the tunnel looks like from the cockpit looking to the aft. There's also a dome up here where the navigator could kind of lean back and take his star shots and sun shots from. This is from the gunner's compartment in the back looking forward. You can see that there's a bit of padding on the bottom. It's a lot easier on the knees as you crawl through this. This is standing in the forward bomb bay looking up, and you can then see the tunnel tube. As you move to the back behind the bomb bays, this is where the tunnel exits, right by this pedestal chair or barber chair where Central Fire Control sits. He has his dome and gun sights. Next to him and below are the right and left gunners sitting in a bubble with a gun sight. The turret is here and nobody is in that turret. So that's the whole idea of pressurization, is that there's nobody freezing to death in a gun turret. You have a lot of equipment here, switching equipment for the guns, and here and under floor, there's a lot of electronic equipment, which we refer to as an analog computer, what passed for as a computer in those days. And between the gun sights themselves and the processing of these computers, they would make the corrections for speed, altitude, temperature, and so on, so that the gun sights could be fairly accurate. And they really did work quite well. Behind this bulkhead would be the radar operator. And here you can see the upper gun turret. Got some crew rest areas and a pressure bulkhead. In our aircraft, standing at the back of that compartment looking forward, we see that pedestal chair. To the left of the pedestal is a bubble, and we call it a blister. And on the other side, the same thing, only this one has the gun sight installed. It's a pretty big and very complex device. It reminds me of the Norden bomb sight because it's doing pretty much the same type of function, trying to put in corrections for the atmospherics to get a better aim. As you turn around and look to the aft, we can see the hatch and the opening and the bulge here for the pressure bulkhead. And then you go into this area, which has a great deal of equipment, but it is not pressurized. The APU, batteries and so forth. The bottom gun turret is back here. And you see this little tube here, this green tube that goes back, that connects to the pressurized area, which now allows this little pressure door here to be closed and to pressurize the tail gunner's small area back here. And then we are remotely firing these guns. It's in a turret, basically. This one shows a 20 millimeter cannon as well as the 250 caliber guns. In our aircraft, we can see the APU and this gas tank along the side. This round area here is where you would have had the mechanism for the lower turret. These are munition boxes, and this is the door going back to the tail gun position. We do allow people who pay for our ride flights and come with us, they are allowed to crawl back there and to get into that tail gun position. So that's a treat and a once in a lifetime experience. Here's what our new 3350/B-29s look like. These engines have turned out to be quite good, reliable, powerful, and I've been very pleased to be able to fly this aircraft with these engines. Just a couple of words about systems, not going into great detail, but in order to have self-sealing tanks, you have to have things split up into numerous tanks. So the outboard engine here has 7 tanks. The inboards each have 4 tanks. And then you have some bomb bay tanks that can be installed for longer missions. Of course, you can't carry the bombs if you're carrying the gas. So sometimes, like in the atom bomb missions, you would have the atom bomb here, you would have fuel tank in the back. And if you read the story of the second atom bomb mission with Boxcar, they had a 600-gallon tank in the back and the pump didn't work. So that caused them a great deal of difficulty during that mission. Oil tanks behind each of the 4 engines hold 90 gallons of oil apiece. So it's a great deal of oil. This graphic here is the same thing, just a little bit clearer view of it. So we can see the fuel tank layout here, including bomb bay tanks. And if you tried to really look at it carefully, you would see a whole lot of piping and pumps and complexity to make this work. This is an electric airplane. The gear takes a lot of power. Flaps take power. These 4 or 5 turrets are electric. They take a lot of power, and it has to be instantaneous. So you have 6 generators. Each outboard engine has 2 generators. The inboard engines each have 1. And in addition, we have a 7th generator back in that auxiliary power unit, or putt-putt. There's a lot of engineering went into this airplane, a lot of marvelous stuff. To this day, you know, you don't walk in there and go, oh, what a bunch of junk. You walk in there and go, wow. You know, how did they engineer this? How did they make this all work? And one example of this, I talked about the flap switches side by side. Here's the motor for the normal flaps. It goes into a gearbox. Right next to it's the emergency switch, and that runs a different motor. All right, so you have redundancy. You have little thumb screws here, which very quickly allow you to remove this motor if the flaps just aren't working. If you don't have electrics, for example, you can put a hand crank in here and crank it. So it's a 3rd level of redundancy. If you have a gear problem, but you have electrics, you can then take this motor, move it over to the side of the aircraft, install it in the slot for the gear, and electrically lower or raise the gear. Way, way more doable than trying to crank the gear by hand. Landing gear here we can see is somewhat complicated, and it has the main gear motor, looks very similar to the motor that is in the flap area. So here we have this beautiful shot by Scott Slocum. He's done a lot of photography for us, and what a beauty. So now we're going to talk about how does she fly. These big bombers, both this and the B-24, have a lot of idiosyncrasies that you need to learn to be comfortable in the airplane. But as you learn them, it becomes easier to fly, and you understand how this thing is going to react. Being at Boeing, it has some certain characteristics that are common. Once I flew the 757 for a lot of years, and I think of this airplane as flying like a 757 once you're up and cruising. It handles very well, and it's smooth and a real joy to fly. However, at lower speeds, the controls are not very effective, and there you have to do a lot of planning and keep your speed up, hit your marks in order to handle the aircraft well. So here we're going to talk a little bit about operational things. So when we have a pilot that's coming and learning this airplane, or you're going through and reviewing because you're getting ready to fly it and you haven't flown it in a while, you may look at this takeoff profile that directs when you would do things, what kind of speed that you need to attain. Oh yes, by the way, when you rotate, you need to tap the brakes before you call gear up. You want to be at 150 before you call flaps up, and so on, the different climb power settings. All right, so that's the purpose of this graphic, to give you that sequence and those elements. And we try to have all of our pilots, and we have about 8 or so aircraft commanders and maybe 10 or so co-pilots, all follow the same procedures to get the performance you expect and to be standard and safe. So here's a summary of that. You go, wow, that's busy. We're not going to read it here today, but just to show you that there's quite a bit to that. And there are 6 crew members on this aircraft that are involved in flying this airplane. So now we're going to go into a really pretty flight. I'm going to bring the volume down a little bit so I can talk about it. This is in Janesville. Kurt Lewis, who's my co-pilot on this flight, arranged this GoPro on the bottom gun turret. So it's a unique and really pretty picture. Notice that you have the flaps out just a little bit. So it's 15-degree flaps for takeoff. It's kind of a right crosswind here on runway 32, beautiful day. And so we take off, touch the brakes, stop the wheels spinning, and now you'll notice the nose gears start to come up and the main gears start to come up here pretty quick. There we go. So in a minute, we'll also see the flaps come up. Now notice the shadow. The shadow means that you're not very high. So here you have these big engines that are putting out about 2,200 horsepower, but guess what? You have a big airplane. So in order to keep engine temperatures where you want them and to accelerate to safe speeds, safer speeds, we have more margin, you stay fairly flat and accelerate. So, okay, here he's got the flaps up, beautiful day, and away we go. So again, I'll throw up the summary of what the procedures are for a takeoff and an abort and who does what and when do they do it. So that video made it look really easy, but remember this complexity. In this video, I'm going to show you it's a different place and time, but it is a takeoff. It runs 2.5 minutes or so. The engine noise kind of gets overwhelming and it kind of breaks through the audio system a little bit, but I'll try to control it here, just so you're aware, on the takeoff where the engine power comes up. So watch for the crew interaction and the amount of air traffic control that's going on. There's always somebody talking. And I, in the left seat, am talking to the flight engineer who's sitting behind the co-pilot. The flight engineer is the guy who is running the engines, and I'm talking to him about the power settings.
Engineer in position. Right scanner position. Left scanner position. APM position. And takeoff briefing. Hey, it's my takeoff, left seat. I've got some right crosswind.
Runway 16,
Look out for.
wind 190 at 11.
I'll pull onto the runway and have you bring them up to 30 inches, Johnny. Okay, and then I'll take the throttles for a bit and get them back to you near the end to set max power. Okay. 125 for BMC, so if we lose an engine before that, we'll abort. Any other minor things, we'll only abort if it's a real low airspeed. Anybody have any questions? We'll plan a right turn out, okay? Let's let them know we're ready if everybody is ready.
Tower 529 Bell, ready for takeoff 16, like to go northwest bound. And I'll call your base turn.
Roger, extend downwind, 32 whiskey.
Superfortress 529 or Bravo, meet you tower. Fly runway heading runway 16, clear for takeoff. Wind 190 at 10.
Clear for takeoff 16 and fly runway heading for 529 Bell.
Baron 5 Romeo Alpha.
Okay, blow the line.
Departure.
Blow line, windows, doors, and hatches.
They're, excuse me, close on the left.
Close on the right.
Close in the back.
Transponders on and set. Strobes and lights I'll get for you. They're on. Pitot heat.
On.
Just stand by there for 1 second.
Turn base.
Okay, ready, Johnny?
Runway
Cow
16,
flaps.
clear for the option.
Cow flaps
Wind
are set.
190
Boost
at
pumps.
12.
High fixtures.
Turbulence departing Superfortress.
For takeoff checklist.
We get started. Clear for the option 16 with option 33. All right, Johnny, so manifold 30. Manifold 30. Pilot throttles. Hey, engineer throttles at max power. Max power.
There's 100.
You're up.
You're up.
Left up. Left up. Climb 1. Climb 1.
All right, so that was a busy flight from the interior compared to what it looked like on the outside. And it's pretty much the norm. So here we have a landing profile, and it's here for the same reason. We want to lay out what kind of a pattern you want to fly, all the elements and their sequence, like 180 miles an hour at 1,500 feet, manifold 2.6, RPM 2,000. So that would be the norm, and you modify that as necessary. Maintain 170 after you get the gear down. So 180 is gear speed, 170 after the gear's down. You go flaps 15, we need at least 160. You want to be at 150, 160 is way better as you're coming into base turn, and then 150 base to final. And then we'll be calling out manifold 2.4, manifold 2.2, and so on. And as you come down into the flare, ease them off. And again, that by knowing what altitudes and speeds you're supposed to be at various times in the pattern, you pretty quickly know whether you're going too fast, too slow, too high, too low, and make the corrections early. So here's what a landing profile summary looks like. It's kind of busy. And I'm going to just show you the external part of a flight. So here we go. This again is in Janesville. Just remember, there's a lot going on in the cockpit during that landing. Bringing on that noise level a bit. Notice the amount of flaps that are out. In this case, it's only 35 degrees. It's not full flaps. And I think the reason I chose that, I think I'm doing the landing here, is that we had a bit of a crosswind. It was a little windy out that day. Actually, Kurt Lewis, my co-pilot, and I couldn't remember who did the takeoff and landing here, so we both agreed that it was us because it turned out well. So here we see the shadow coming up as we're coming in to the end of the runway. So very calm and collected, no big deal. And in the cockpit, we're very busy. Now, we'll have a little snippet here. It's going to jump because I halted it. Watch the outboard engines. They're going to spool down. I've called for the flight engineer to X the props. And so we shut down the outboard engines. And on the left side, number one engine, he is using the starter to move that propeller until it's in the X position. And that is so it could go over the top of any kind of lights that might be in the way. This is a pretty nice airport, and I don't know if we actually had to or we're just being cautious. But again, you can see these lights right here. And as you get into the narrower area, you could be hitting those with a prop if it was spinning. The northern airports have tall lights because they have tall snowbanks. So again, that's what that profile looks like, a lot going on. I want to take a moment here to speak of Niels Agather, the son of FIFI. We saw in another picture where he was with Randy Sohn. So his dad is Vic Agather, his mom is FIFI, and he's been an integral part, along with his brother John, of the CAF for many, many years. I've been around just 9 years, but Niels has been working on the general staff. He's held a lot of roles. And since I've been here, he was our B-29, B-24 Squadron commander for 8 years from 2010 to 2018. He's been on the general staff a number of times, which is like our board of directors. He's done significant work on our national air base, putting that together. And he sponsors quite a few of our different aircraft. It's been very helpful in that regard. And he does much more. So here he is addressing one of our ground schools, and we very much appreciate what he has done for the CAF. Happy birthday to FIFI, 75th anniversary of her birthday here, July 31st. So celebrate with us. So again, we're back to this slide, which talks about how we are trying to go through this year without the ability to have our Air Power History Tour, and that's a tall order. So as with many other organizations, we're trying fundraisers and so forth, and we think we have a compelling reason for people to support us if they're able. and that is to keep these aircraft flying. It's about the airplanes. But as an incentive, we're on the sustaining flight campaign. We do have the sneakers with the FIFI logo. If you're interested in that, you can order them by clicking on that button. That's been ongoing for a while. There's about a month left in that program. So if you're interested, please do so. Starting today, we have this new Books for Bombers. And this is designed to have 2 more choices. One's B-29 centric and one's for the B-24. So if you click here to donate, you'll come to a page with a little more information. And then here is a blow up of, we have this particular book, we have our own edition of it. B-29 Superfortress FIFI 75th birthday edition. So not just on the cover, but in the first 3 pages is history of this aircraft, the lineage of it, the different places she's been, things she's done. So we're very proud of that, and we hope this is a compelling draw for you. Charles Phillips, I talked about earlier. I'm so impressed with what's in this book, and I believe you will be too, so we hope that you give it consideration. CAF B-29B24.org is how you get to our main page. All right. Now, in a similar way, we have this book for the B-24s, and this is a magnificent book. This is a 8.5 by 11 hardcover, like 3 inches thick. It's over 500 pages, and it's a definitive history of the 93rd Bomb Group in the 8th Air Force. And this outfit was in England. They were in North Africa. They flew Ploesti missions. And I made a little note over here. There's over 100 pages on the Ploesti raid. So if you want to know something about it, it's in there. Cal Stewart was the adjutant to General Timberlake here, pictured here. And he had access to a lot of material, and this book is just loaded with it. He also has a section on hot stuff, the crew that flew 31 combat missions before the Memphis Belle flew 25. There's a book about that called Before the Bell that I'll mention. So it's about the loss of the aircraft after all this happened and of General Frank Andrews. Really good stuff, but all of that is in this book. And so we hope that it's compelling for you. So before we wrap this up, we'd just like to invite you to join us. Come and be part of our squadron. We have 300 and some members. People come and go. We'd love to have you come. And you start out simply by going to that website, CAFB29B24.org. And here's the homepage. And there's a join or renew button. And you can fly with us. You go out on tour with us. Or you can work on a local project. Or you can work on the aircraft. There's many different places. Right now, we are housed at the Vintage Flying Museum at Meacham Airport in Fort Worth. Both FIFI and Diamond Lil are there. Our headquarters is being built. 2021 should be a time frame that we are in there. So, you know, stay in touch, see where we are next year. This is a picture from 2020. If you happen to have caught the news on the 4th of July, our girl FIFI flew over the Capitol area. As part of our crew, I was not on this mission, but it was historic and a real opportunity for us and for our aircraft. The Arsenal of Democracy, a similar flyover, but with more aircraft, about 100 aircraft, World War II aircraft, will be happening on September 25th of this year. I do hope to be on the crew of that one. And watch for it and support us so we can do that. So help us keep flying in 2021 and beyond. It's up to all of us to work hard to make that happen. So thank you very much for supporting us. We had a good time with this. If you have comments to make, please make them on the YouTube channel so that we can respond there rather than trying to send it to us or to our office separately. So anyway, we'd be happy to answer your questions if you post anything there. So thanks a lot. Have a great day.